Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're doing a deep dive into a really significant book, H.R. McMaster's Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World.
Yeah, it's quite the analysis, not just looking back, but really trying to understand the challenges we're facing now.
Exactly. It's a look at, well, the big threats authoritarian powers like Russia and China, for starters.
And those persistent problems, places like Afghanistan, the Middle East, they don't just go away.
Right. And McMaster ties it all together with this core argument about needing strategic competence in U.S. foreign policy. He wants us to move past what he calls strategic narcissism.
That's a key concept for him, definitely. We'll unpack that.
So our mission today is to explore these themes, these interconnected global issues, basically following the flow of the book chronologically. We want to pull out the key insights for you.
Sounds good. And McMaster kicks off really thinking about the period right after the Cold War.
Oh.
It's interesting. He sees it as, yes, a huge victory for the free world, obviously. But he suggests it also kind of bred some overconfidence.
Like, we won, history's over, that kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah. A feeling that maybe the big ideological fights were done, and perhaps we underestimated the threats that were still bubbling up, or old threats coming back in new ways.
Okay, let's dig into that. He gives specific examples, doesn't he? Like Russia.
Absolutely. The slide back to autocracy under Putin, McMaster points out, Putin being ex-KGB, later FSB, he knew how power worked.
And the early reforms in Russia, the market stuff in the 90s, that kind of stalled out.
It did. And that created an opening, McMaster argues, for Putin to consolidate control. And it wasn't just Russia. He also points to Iran, where reform movements got stamped out as the Islamist regime tightened its grip.
So multiple places seeing this pushback against openness.
Precisely. And looking wider, geopolitically, this period where the U.S. seemed dominant, well, others were watching, China especially.
Right. He talks about the 1991 Gulf War and the Taiwan Strait crisis in 96.
Yeah, the 96 crisis was critical. The U.S. sent a strong naval force in response to Chinese missile tests, and it starkly showed China, their PLA Navy just wasn't up to par then.
Okay, so that was a wake-up call for Beijing.
A major one, according to McMaster. He argues it was a huge learning experience. As their economy boomed, they poured money into military modernization. That public display of naval weakness really fueled their long-term drive to build up their forces.
It leads us neatly into this idea you mentioned earlier, strategic narcissism. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. It's a term McMaster borrows from Hans Morgenthau. Essentially, it's this tendency for a nation, particularly the U.S. in his analysis, to view world events primarily through the lens of its own actions and decisions.
Meaning we overestimate our own influence, or think everything revolves around us.
Both, in a way. It creates, as McMaster puts it, these two mindsets. Sometimes overconfidence, thinking we can fix anything, and sometimes resignation, thinking nothing we do matters. Both undervalue what other countries or actors are doing, their own motivations, their own agency.
And that connects to those swings in U.S. foreign policy he mentions. Optimism, then pessimism.
Exactly. You see this pendulum swing. We think we can reshape the world, then we get disillusioned when it doesn't happen easily, and we pull back. He argues this strategic narcissism is behind some of the missed signals after the Cold War.
Underestimating the resilience of autocracy, maybe? Or the complexity of local issues?
Yeah, precisely. Believing democracy would just inevitably spread, and then being surprised when it didn't, or when powers like Russia and China pushed back hard.
Okay, let's pivot to Russia more directly. McMaster details their strategy, post-2017 especially, to actively undermine the U.S. and Western democracies.
Oh, absolutely. It's a sustained effort. Cyber attacks, obviously, but also these complex information warfare campaigns. He points to interference in European elections and, of course, the 2016 U.S. election.
And he has that phrase, the fire hose of falsehood.
Right. It's not necessarily about making you believe one specific lie. It's about overwhelming you with a constant stream of disinformation, often contradictory stuff. The goal is to sow confusion, erode trust in institutions, make it hard to know what to believe.
Just muddy the waters completely.
Exactly. And amplify existing divisions in society.
He gives examples, right? Ukraine.
Ukraine saw election interference and cyber attacks. Montenegro, 2 serious attempts to derail its democracy. And then there's the IRA, the Internet Research Agency.
The Russian troll farm.
Yeah, basically a front for the GRU, their military intelligence.
Yeah.
They use Facebook, Twitter, Google, Reddit, even things like Pokemon Go, bizarrely, to spread divisive content and polarize Americans.
It was a huge operation.
Massive. creating fake personas, targeting different groups with tailored messages. McMaster points out this tricky thing where even media trying to debunk the conspiracies sometimes ended up amplifying them just by reporting on them.
And the GOU also tried to compromise Trump during the campaign and discredit the Mueller probe later.
McMaster lays out how they tried, yes. He suggests vulnerabilities in the campaign and the political environment maybe made it easier for Moscow to sow doubt about the election's integrity.
Beyond information, what about other Russian tactics?
Economic pressure is a big one. Energy dependence, many European countries relying on Russian gas. That gives Moscow leverage.
Like with Nord Stream 2.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And cyber threats against critical infrastructure. He mentions reports of them probing U.S. nuclear power plants. That's serious intimidation.
Which understandably caused friction within NATO and with European allies. Macron's brain death comment for NATO comes to mind.
Right. Tensions were high. And Russia, despite breaking international norms with things like Nord Stream 2, kept expanding its economic influence.
But McMaster also contrasts this aggressive foreign policy with Russia's actual economic size.
He does. It's a striking point. In 2019, Russia's GDP was about the same as Texas. It highlights the limits of their actual power, even if they punch above their weight geopolitically.
He seems quite critical of the West's response, suggesting we were slow to grasp the threat.
Yeah, he argues the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine, those should have been clearer wake-up calls. He also talks about this recurring optimism bias in U.S. presidents, hoping to reset relations with Putin, maybe not fully appreciating the KGB playbook Putin operates from.
So, how to counter this? What does McMaster suggest for parrying Putin's playbook, as he puts it?
The main thing is exposing the disinformation, calling it out relentlessly, and challenging the denials.
Being proactive, not just reactive.
Exactly. He mentions U.S. Cyber Command's shift to persistent engagement, being more active in disrupting hostile cyber ops, like actions reportedly taken against the IRA in the 2018 midterms. And this idea from Thomas Edwards about presenting your own accurate information first to sort of preempt the lies.
Okay, let's shift gears to China. McMaster sees the challenge from the CCP under Xi Jinping as even bigger than Russia.
In many ways, yes. Largely because of the scale of China's ambition and the sheer comprehensiveness of their strategy. It's economic, technological, military, diplomatic. It's everything, everywhere.
He talks about the early Trump administration meetings, Mar-a-Lago.
He does, but he quickly contrasts Trump's narrative of national greatness with Xi's. Xi's vision is tied deeply to the CCP's control and this long view of history, this idea of national rejuvenation.
And Xi looks back to China's imperial past, unlike Mao.
Right. McMaster contrasts Xi's nostalgia with Mao's iconoclasm. But he also makes sure to remind us of the immense human cost of Mao's rule, the famine, the purges, and the key lesson the CCP took from Tiananmen Square.
Never lose control.
Absolutely. That obsession with control, McMaster argues, drives everything, including their model of state-sponsored capitalism. It's not just about wealth, it's about expanding CCP power and influence, often undermining democratic norms globally.
Initiatives like Made in China 2025 and military-civil fusion.
Key parts of the plan. Made in China 2025 is about dominating key tech sectors. And military-civil fusion is crucial. It basically means any tech developed in China, even by private companies, is available to the PLA, the military. There's no real distinction.
And their strategy involves co-option, coercion, concealment.
That's how he frames it. Co-opting elites, coercing those who resist, and concealing their intentions. This includes building that massive surveillance state, using tech monopolies, and, frankly, widespread intellectual property theft.
The Belt and Road Initiative fits into this too.
Definitely. McMaster argues it's not just economics, it's deeply strategic, building influence, creating dependencies, putting China at the center of global trade routes. He uses the arrest of Professor Charlie Lieber as an example of organized tech transfer efforts.
And then there are the flashpoints, Taiwan, the South China Sea.
Yeah, very tense areas. China's ratcheting up pressure on Taiwan, diplomatic isolation, economic carrots and sticks, military intimidation. And in the South China Sea, they just ignore international rulings and keep building and militarizing artificial islands.
So U.S. policy had to shift away from thinking engagement alone would change China.
McMaster argues forcefully for that shift. He stresses the need for strategic empathy. Not sympathy, but understanding the CCP's motivations, that obsession with control, the drive for national rejuvenation. You have to understand why they do what they do.
Interesting that he mentions Trump acknowledging some U.S. fault in past trade practices.
Yeah, small point, but perhaps reflects an attempt at that empathy, or at least acknowledging complexity. McMaster also touches on protecting academic freedom for Chinese students here, while being aware of risks and seeing expatriate communities as a potential asset.
But the main worry is China using the West's openness against itself.
That's a core concern, preventing them from leveraging our open economy and society to advance their state capitalist surveillance model. That's why he pushes hard for multinational cooperation democracies, working together on defense, countering economic coercion, pushing back on influence campaigns.
The security risks of Huawei, ZTE.
Big focus there. He sees them as instruments of the state. He covers the trade war, the Phase 1 deal, but ultimately stresses this fundamental conflict between our free market model and their state-controlled one.
Let's move to Afghanistan. He calls it a one-year war fought 20 times over. What does that capture?
It captures the frustrating cycle. Initial optimism after the Taliban fell, followed by years of struggling with the same basic problems, never quite getting the strategy right for the long haul. He critiques the failure to really grasp the local politics, the tribal, ethnic, religious rivalries driving the violence.
And unrealistic expectations plagued the effort.
Constantly. And no consistent, realistic long-term strategy. He reminds us of the U.S. Embassy reopening after the Soviets left, then the Civil War, and how the Taliban initially gained some traction by promising order against the warlords.
The assassination of Massoud, that backfired on the Taliban.
Ironically, yes. It was meant to cripple the Northern Alliance just before 9/11, but it ended up rallying them. McMaster also hits hard on the corruption ghost soldiers, aid being diverted, enriching corrupt officials, and the Taliban.
He mentions meetings with generals like Mick Nicholson. What was their assessment?
They saw the ongoing counterterrorism fight, but also stressed the need for strong Afghan institutions, which were incredibly difficult to build. And he notes how little attention the American public often paid to the war's complexities.
The role of Pakistan's ISI comes up frequently.
Hugely problematic. McMaster details their support for the Taliban, driving a wedge between Afghan leaders like Karzai and the U.S. Karzai himself became increasingly anti-American over time.
And this is another example of strategic narcissism.
Right.
Imposing solutions, ignoring local realities.
He argues, yes, trying to fit Afghanistan into an American mold, not fully grappling with the deep-seated local dynamics or Pakistan's destructive role. The assumptions behind a negotiated withdrawal were flawed, he thinks, without changes in regional behavior.
He met with President Ghani.
Yes, and found they shared a grim view of Afghanistan as this frontier between, as they put it, civilization and barbarism.
But he does acknowledge some positive changes despite the war.
He does. Refugees returning, more kids in school, especially girls in cities. Society a change. But then you have Pakistan's double game, sometimes helping against al-Qaeda, but consistently backing the Taliban.
Why did Pakistan back the Taliban?
Strategic depth against India, preventing Pashtun nationalism that might challenge Pakistani borders. Complex reasons, but ultimately destabilizing for Afghanistan.
He describes talks with Pakistani military leaders.
Yeah, Generals Bajwa and Naveed. A cycle of raised hopes, promises made, then disappointment, as Pakistan's actions didn't match their words. He stresses how interconnected all these militant groups are in the AfPak region, dreaming of Khorasan.
The Haqqani network gets specific mention.
For their brutality, yes.
Yeah.
Orchestrating major attacks. McMaster also reflects on the negative legacy of past U.S. support for figures like Zia-ul Haq in Pakistan. He also notes shared concerns with India's PM Modi, particularly about China.
And he racks up Afghanistan referencing Trump's Fort Myers speech.
Yes, trying to articulate the value of the sacrifices made, while acknowledging the fight continued, citing the killing of the AQIS leader.
Okay, shifting to the Middle East. Iraq first. The fight against ISIS.
He notes the Iraqi forces took the brunt of the casualties, far more than the U.S., but concerns about Iranian influence in Iraq were and are persistent.
He gives some historical background.
Briefly, yeah. Pan-Arabism, the Baathists, the Iran-Iraq War, the rise of Shia identity under Khomeini, setting the stage. He shares a personal story about Iraqi PM Abadi losing brothers under Saddam.
And strategic narcissism comes up again regarding the Iraq War.
Yes. The belief that fewer troops would work, ignoring how the occupation itself became a recruiting tool for AQI, the precursor to ISIS.
So what fueled ISIS's rise, in his view?
A toxic mix. Alienating Sunnis in Iraq, Iranian meddling, and critically the Syrian civil war, creating chaos and ungoverned space. He's also critical of the Libya intervention, removing Gaddafi without a plan for what came next.
Obama's withdrawal from Iraq.
McMaster argues that disengagement worsened things, creating a vacuum filled by Russia and Iran. Syria became a humanitarian disaster under Assad's brutality.
And ISIS used that base to attack Europe.
Yes, directed attacks, plus the danger of returning foreign fighters. Tensions with Iran also escalated rocket attacks on U.S. bases, the embassy attack in Baghdad.
Meanwhile, protests in Iraq against corruption and Iranian influence
Show the internal dynamics were complex. But overall, U.S. influence in the region seemed diminished. McMaster argues for strengthening legitimate governance and countering malign actors.
Libya remained fractured. Turkey drifted.
Yes, Libya fragmented with militias and foreign meddling. Turkey moved further from NATO. He also stresses cutting off terrorist financing.
It's a long-term threat, this jihadist ideology.
Multi-generational, he calls it. Need to prevent ISIS successors. He mentions the killing of Baghdadi and his successor. Briefly touches on Israel-Palestine and the Peace to Prosperity plan.
And the big lesson is that regime change doesn't automatically equal freedom.
Crucially. And that U.S. disengagement can be dangerous. Now, focusing specifically on Iran, he's quite critical of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal.
Why? What was the flaw?
He argues it was too narrow, focused only on the nuclear program while ignoring Iran's regional aggression, the missiles, the proxies, the destabilization. It lacks strategic empathy, he thinks, failing to grasp the regime's ideology and historical drivers.
He sees a long history of failed U.S. strategies towards Iran since '79.
Absolutely. He contrasts Obama's hopes for the deal with Iran's continued bad behavior afterward. He lists other attempts, Reagan's arms for hostages, Bush Sr.'s outreach saying none really worked because they didn't address the regime's fundamental nature.
Iran kept testing missiles, funding proxies, even after the deal.
Yes. And he mentions the controversial cash pallets sent by the Obama administration. He argues U.S. policy often ignored who the regime is.
He pushes back on the narrative about the U.S. being solely responsible for Iran's path, mentioning Mossadegh.
He does. He argues that narrative is too simplistic, and that conciliation hasn't moderated Tehran's hostility. He points to deeper historical roots of resentment, the concept of layat faqih, rule of the jurist, but also notes internal opposition exists.
Khamenei sees the U.S. as declining.
That's McMaster's reading. He covers the Soleimani strike, the impact of sanctions, Iran's use of proxies like Hezbollah, the anti-Hezbollah protests in Lebanon.
Iran's hostility to Israel remains constant.
Unwavering. And he discusses the complex, sometimes cooperative links between Iran and some Sunni jihadist groups, despite ideology. The big danger, a nuclear Iran, given their ideology.
So the JCPOA didn't solve the core problem.
Not in his view. He argues for a strategy that forces Iran to choose. Economic collapse or a comprehensive deal covering everything. Nukes, missiles, proxies, WMDs. He sees Khamenei facing internal pressure but still trying to export the revolution.
Briefly on Korea, he mentions moving to Fort McNair.
Yeah, historical site. He then discusses the complexities with South Korea under President Moon, a political scandal there, different views on engaging the North, the Sunshine Policy.
But U.S. troops remain vital.
Still strategically crucial, he argues, despite South Korea's success. The U.S. presence has also deterred Seoul and Tokyo from going nuclear themselves.
China's initial response on North Korea wasn't totally negative.
Not overtly, at least initially. He also notes generational differences in South Korean views on the U.S. and North Korea.
Trump and Moon agreed on maximum pressure.
Yes. McMaster holds on to the idea that consistent pressure could maybe make Kim Jong-un see a nuclear-free path as safer and better for him.
But coordinating that within the U.S. government is hard.
Very. Different agencies, different priorities. He describes North Korea starkly. Hereditary dictatorship, military first, horrific human rights abuses.
Views are divided in South Korea and Japan on how to handle the North.
Definitely. And he reminds us of North Korea's history of terrorism and abductions. Opening up could be seen by Kim as regime suicide.
Trump tried to separate his personal rapport with Kim from the actual negotiations.
Yeah, an unusual approach. McMaster stresses the need for the U.S. and allies to plan for all scenarios, including potential military action, even if it's a last resort.
He suggests pressure and outreach aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. Maximum pressure on the regime while trying to get information to the North Korean people, perhaps using technology to bypass the state's control.
Okay, finally, the last chapter, entering the arena. This broadens the scope.
It does. He looks at interconnected global challenges, cyber, space, climate change, pandemics, things that cross borders easily. He warns about the dual-use nature of tech, how adversaries can use it for repression.
And the downsides of the internet?
Social media, toxicity, disinformation, the erosion of shared facts. He calls for digital resilience, balancing freedom and security online.
He encourages engaging with different views, finding common ground.
Yes, trying to counter polarization. He also sees potential in space for monitoring the environment, maybe future energy solutions like space-based solar,
He contrasts Cold War tech development with today's more open model.
and warns about U.S. investment inadvertently helping Chinese companies linked to the PLA. He sees a growing split between democratic and autocratic models of data governance.
Cooperation is still needed, though, on things like weapons proliferation.
Absolutely. Especially preventing the spread of the most dangerous weapons. Missile defense is key, and the emerging threat of autonomous drones aerial and underwater.
In climate change.
He stresses strategic empathy here too, understanding different nations' challenges. Reducing coal is a huge politically tough issue globally.
So, wrapping up McMaster's argument, it's all connected.
That's the big takeaway. What Russia does affects China's calculations. What happens in the Middle East impacts global security. Tech competition underlies it all. His call for strategic competence isn't just military. It's about understanding these complex links and having a consistent, adaptable strategy to defend free world principles.
Absolutely. And as we finish this deep dive into Battlegrounds, those themes really stick with you. The threats are real and evolving. Strategic competence grounded in realism is vital. And maybe most crucially, we have to learn from past mistakes. It's not just history, it's essential for the future.
Which brings us to a final thought for you listening. McMaster lays out this incredibly complex web of global challenges. So the question becomes, what do you think is the single biggest obstacle we face in trying to build a more secure, more prosperous world right now? Is it the rise of authoritarianism? Is it those persistent regional conflicts? Or is it maybe just the sheer difficulty of getting nations to work together effectively on these huge shared problems? Something to mull over.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into H.R. McMaster's Battlegrounds. We hope it's given you some valuable insights. Until next time, take care.